They laughed. That cruel, hollow kind of laughter that slices through a room like broken glass. A man, frail in body but unshakable in spirit, stood in the middle of the bank lobby, his skin weathered by decades, his back bent yet unbroken. He said just 5 words, and the world around him seemed to pause before it erupted into mockery. "This bank belongs to me." A white teller smirked, whispered to another employee, and they stifled their giggles like schoolchildren. Customers turned their heads, rolling their eyes, dismissing him as some senile old man who had wandered in from the street. The security guard puffed up his chest, stepping closer as if to remind the world that authority had a uniform. But behind that laugh, behind that mockery, lay something the crowd couldn't yet sense, a storm gathering in silence. Because this wasn't a man who came to beg, this wasn't a man lost in delusion. This was a man who carried truth inside him like a ticking time bomb. And here's the part that should disturb you. The laughter wasn't about disbelief. No, beneath it was something uglier, something Americans have buried for generations. It was the laughter of superiority, the kind used for centuries to dismiss a black man daring to stand where he didn't belong. But Elijah didn't flinch. His voice, cracked by age but sharpened by conviction, cut through the noise. He spoke names, dates, numbers, the kind of details you can't invent. He spoke of signatures long forgotten, of ledgers that carried ink older than the very tiles on the floor. And as the laughter faltered, something else began to rise. Fear. Do you feel it yet? The unsettling shift when the joke stops being funny, when you realize the target of your mockery might be holding something dangerous. The truth. Here's where you need to lean closer. This is not just about one man in one bank. This is about the ghosts of every boardroom. Every courthouse, every deal signed in shadows that erased the name of a black founder and replaced it with a white one. This is about how history gets stolen, rewritten, polished until the thieves look like pioneers and the pioneers look like nobodies. So when Elijah stood there, frail, trembling, mocked, what you were really witnessing was not weakness. It was the resurrection of buried history, dragged into the light where the laughter had nowhere left to hide. And if you think this was just another crazy old man's story, you're already falling into the same trap as the crowd. The guard's hand hovered near his hip, fingers brushing the weapon like a silent warning. The teller's smirk cracked into something colder, a thin mask of superiority hiding fear she could not name. Yet Elijah remained still, his presence louder than any threat, his eyes, dark and unwavering, locked on the manager's glass office door. He knew where the real battle lay, not in fists, not in guns, but in truth. He reached into his coat with the kind of deliberate slowness that made the room hold its breath. The guard tensed, customers shifted uneasily, someone whispered, "He's dangerous." And then he pulled out nothing more than a battered leather folder, its edges frayed, its surface stained with time. He placed it on the counter with a soft thud. That sound echoed in ways the crowd couldn't understand. Inside were papers so old they carried the smell of history itself, yellowed pages, fading ink, a ledger that had survived storms, relocations, even attempts to bury it. Elijah's voice grew steadier, cutting the silence like a blade. "Before any of you were born, before these walls stood, before your family names were carved into marble and steel, this bank bore my signature, mine." The crowd stiffened. No one laughed now. Some looked away, uncomfortable, as though they had witnessed something they wouldn't. But one young teller leaned closer, curiosity overtaking fear. She squinted at the ledger, and her lips parted as she whispered, "His name, it's right here." Elijah's gaze swept the room. "Do you know why they laugh at me? Because laughter is the cheapest weapon of the guilty. It is how the powerful dismiss the inconvenient. But truth never dies. It waits, patiently, until a moment like this." And that's when the air shifted again. Not just fear, not just disbelief, but recognition. Somewhere deep in their bones, they knew he wasn't lying. You've felt this before, haven't you? That unsettling moment when reality bends, when the story you've been fed all your life begins to crack and something darker spills out. That's the moment the comfortable become restless, because truth threatens the foundation their entire identity stands on. Remember this, institutions are not built on marble, steel, or money. They are built on memory, and memory can be stolen. Elijah wasn't just reclaiming a bank, he was reclaiming the theft of an entire generation's dignity. And in that room, for the first time, silence was louder than laughter. Elijah's fingers traced the brittle edge of the ledger as if it were a living wound. His voice trembled, but not from weakness, from the unbearable weight of memory. 48, he said, and the year fell heavy in the room. The year I founded what you now call your bank. A dream carved out of long nights, empty pockets, and a refusal to bow. The guard scoffed, but quieter now. The manager stepped out of his glass box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor, his smile tight and corporate. "Sir, you're mistaken," he said. "This bank has been owned by the Matthews family for generations." Elijah's lips curled, not into a smile, but into something sharper. The Matthews family. He paused, letting the silence choke the air. They didn't build this. They stole it, and they stole it from me. The crowd gasped, some in disbelief, others in fascination. Elijah's words painted images no one could ignore. A young black man in the 40s, denied Loa, Ann's denied respect, laughed at by bankers who told him his people didn't belong in business. And yet, through sheer will, he scraped together investors, carved his way into legitimacy, and opened the doors to his own institution. But then came John Williams, his so-called partner, the man Elijah trusted, a man with a smile too wide and a handshake too smooth. They toasted success together, spoke of legacy, of building something their grandchildren would inherit. But behind closed doors, John was signing different papers, shaking different hands. Hands of the Matthews family. Hands that had crushed dreams before and would do it again. "They told me I was crazy," Elijah said, his voice now low, dangerous. "They said no court would side with a black man against white elites. And they were right. They erased my name from every document, every plaque, every archive. They paid off judges, buried the truth, rewrote the story until I was nothing but a ghost." The manager's smile faltered. His polished exterior cracked just enough for the room to notice. And here's the part you need to hear. Elijah didn't just lose a bank. He lost decades of recognition, of wealth that should have secured his children, his grandchildren. That theft wasn't just about money. It was about lineage. It was about telling the world that a black man's success was too dangerous to exist. Look closer. Do you see it now? This isn't one man's tragedy. It's a mirror. How many stories, how many families, how many legacies have been stolen, erased, rewritten to fit the comfort of those in power? That's why Elijah came back. Not for revenge, but for truth. And truth, once spoken, cannot be buried again. Elijah opened the leather folder wider, and from its depths he drew something that made the room lean in, whether they wanted to or not. It wasn't just paper. It was currency, old banknotes, faded but unmistakable stamp, Ed with signatures that did not belong to the Matthews family. His name, printed, sealed, proof that history had been rewritten with ink that lied. The young teller gasped again, her voice trembling. This can't be forged. These are originals." She touched the edge of one note as if it burned. The manager snatched it from the counter, his fingers twitching with a desperation he tried to disguise as professionalism. He inspected the watermark, the ink, the age. His lips thinned, his jaw tightened. He knew what he was holding was real. But to admit it was real meant tearing open a wound his institution had been paid to keep stitched shut. Elijah's voice grew louder, firmer, as he pulled out documents. Legal contracts bearing his name, notarized signatures from 1948, business licenses that carried the seal of the city itself. He held them up like weapons, each page a blade aimed at the lies that had stood for generations. "Tell me," he said, his gaze piercing every face in the room, "how does a man forge his own handwriting from 70 years ago? How does he produce the city's own stamp, the county's own ledger, unless it was truth? You've been living in their story, not mine. And today, I am taking it back." The guard shifted uneasily now, no longer sure whom he was protecting, the people in the bank, or the empire of deception built on stolen legacy. Customers whispered to one another, the laughter long gone, replaced by murmurs of shock, of doubt, of awakening. And then Elijah said something that froze the room. "Every dollar you hold, every account you open, traces its bloodline back to me. You've been profiting from a theft older than most of you. Do you feel proud, or do you feel complicit?" The silence was suffocating. No one dared move, because deep down they understood the weight of those words. If his proof was real, and it was, then they weren't just witnesses, they were participants in a lie. Here's the part that should haunt you. The most dangerous man is not the one with a gun, but the one with receipts. Elijah didn't just walk into that bank with a story. He walked in carrying history itself, unbroken, undeniable, and ready to detonate in their faces. And in that moment the institution shook. Not its walls, not its floors, but its illusion of righteousness. The guard had been pacing like a caged animal, hand twitching closer to his holster with every word Elijah spoke. Proof was dangerous, and he knew what it meant if the old man's evidence held weight. This wasn't about keeping order anymore. It was about protecting the story his bosses demanded be protected. "Sir, that's enough," he barked, stepping forward, chest swelling with authority. "You're disturbing the peace. Put the papers down and leave before I make you leave." Elijah didn't flinch. He turned slowly, eyes sharp, and looked at the guard as if staring into the face of history itself. "You're not here to protect peace. You're here to protect lies. And the difference between us is this. Your weapon kills flesh, but my truth kills empires." The crowd gasped, the words slicing through the stale air. But the guard wasn't interested in words. His hand snapped to his gun, fingers curling around the grip. The metallic click of the safety released echoed like thunder. Customers shrieked, ducking behind counters. Fear filled the room, thick and suffocating. For a moment, the story teetered on the edge of violence. An old black man staring down the barrel of institutional force. The image itself was too familiar, too American, a story replayed across decades in streets, churches, homes. The symbolism was unbearable, one man armed with memory, the other armed with a gun. But Elijah stood tall, taller than his frail body should have allowed. "Go ahead," he whispered, voice steady. "Pull the trigger. Spill my blood on this floor and prove every word I've spoken right. Show them that truth frightens you more than bullets. Show them what this bank was really built on, power enforced, through fear." The guard froze. His chest heaved. Sweat glistened on his temple. His training screamed at him to act, but his soul knew what the eyes around the room already knew. If he fired, the lie would die louder than the truth. And here's where you must pay attention, because silence fell again, not from peace but from terror. Not Elijah's terror, theirs. Terror of exposure, terror that violence would no longer bury what had been unearthed. The manager's voice cracked as he shouted, "Stand down!" But it was too late. The crowd had seen it, the gun, the proof, the imbalance of power. They couldn't unsee it. And deep inside, they began to wonder, if this man had the courage to face death for his truth, maybe that truth was more real than the world they had chosen to believe. The air was charged, every breath heavy with the threat that violence might erupt at any second. The guard's hand still hovered, trembling, but the weight of 100 eyes pinned him down. And then, it happened. The youngest teller, the same one who had first dared to read Elijah's name aloud, stepped forward. Her voice quivered, but her conviction sharpened with every word. "He's telling the truth. I've seen signatures like this in our archives, documents buried in the restricted section no one talks about. His name was there. I remember." The manager spun toward her, face red, voice shaking with rage. "Enough! You don't know what you're saying!" But his anger sounded less like authority and more like panic. And then another voice rose, an older customer in the back, a man who had lived long enough to recognize when history was repeating itself. "I knew about this," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Whispers, rumors. My father told me stories about a black man who founded a bank but was robbed blind. Everyone laughed at it like it was folklore. Maybe it wasn't a story. Maybe it was the truth." The room shifted. The laughter that had once mocked Elijah had turned into murmurs of belief. People glanced at one another, uncertain but awakening, and one by one the silence cracked. A woman pulled a crumpled bill from her purse, placed it on the counter in front of Elijah, and whispered, "This is yours." Another man followed, then another. Soon a small pile of money lay before him, not as payment, but as acknowledgement. The guard, still frozen, lowered his weapon just an inch. Enough to show the crowd he was no longer sure of his authority. The manager shouted, desperate, "This is madness. You're being manipulated by an old man's delusions." But no one listened. The crowd wasn't following delusion. They were following courage. And here's the part you must not miss. Movements don't begin with armies. They begin with one trembling voice daring to break the silence, one truth too stubborn to die, one act of defiance that spreads like fire. That bank lobby had become more than a room. It had become a battlefield between memory and myth. Elijah didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply placed his hand on the pile of bills and whispered, "I don't need your money. I only need your eyes open." And for the first time, the institution itself began to lose its grip. Not by force, not by power, but by truth taking root where fear once lived. The manager's face drained of color. His carefully crafted corporate smile, the one he wore like armor, collapsed into something raw and unguarded. Fear. He wasn't just looking at an old man with papers anymore. He was staring at a mirror that reflected the corruption he had been paid to protect. He slammed the ledger shut, almost desperate, his voice cracking under the strain. "None of this will hold in court. You think a stack of old paper is enough to undo 70 years of history? The Matthews family has power you cannot even begin to imagine. You think the law will save you?" Elijah stepped closer, his presence commanding more than the polished suits and fake authority ever could. "No," he said, voice low, steady. "The law was never made for army, but truth doesn't need permission to exist. It only needs witnesses. And now I have them." The crowd stirred, eyes shifting from the manager to Elijah. Whispers grew bolder. "He's right. It makes sense. Why would he lie?" The walls that once felt like steel barriers for the institution now seemed like paper-thin screens barely hiding the rot inside. The manager's hands shook as he gripped the documents tighter, as if clutching them could strangle the truth out of existence. But the harder he held, the more the evidence seemed to burn him. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "If this gets out, if this story spreads, everything collapses. Everything. And here is where you must listen closely. When a man begins to mutter to himself, when power begins to taste its own fragility, the mask slips. You see not strength, but panic. You see not leadership, but the desperate scramble of someone trying to stop a flood with bare hands." Elijah leaned in so close the manager could feel the weight of his words. "The only thing collapsing is the lie you've been standing on. And when lies collapse, truth doesn't just rise, it consumes." The crowd hushed, every ear tuned to the duel between one man's truth and another's desperation. For the first time, the manager looked small, his expensive suit nothing but fabric draped over a man who had lost control. And here's the hook you cannot ignore. Institutions do not fall when the powerful admit defeat. They fall when the powerless stop believing the lie. And in that bank, belief was slipping through his fingers faster than he could clutch it. The manager swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "Do you have any idea who you're up against?" Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Yes. I'm up against the same thing I've been fighting my entire life. Men who mistake theft for legacy." The room had changed. What began as a scene of mockery was now an arena of revelation. The customers who once laughed now stood shoulder to shoulder, their whispers turning into words, their doubt into defiance. The guard had lowered his weapon, the teller, no longer hid behind her counter. The balance of power was shifting right before their eyes. Elijah looked around, his voice rising with a strength that seemed impossible for a man his age. "For 70 years, they erased me. They rewrote my story until I was nothing more than a rumor, a ghost, a man no one would believe. But today, my truth has spoken. And it does not speak for me alone. It speaks for every name stolen, every legacy buried, every dream crushed beneath the weight of greed and skin color." The manager tried to speak, but his words cracked into silence. He had lost them. The institution had lost them. And Elijah, standing small in body but colossal in spirit, commanded the room as if he had built it with his bare hands. He placed both hands on the counter, leaned forward, and declared, "History does not belong to thieves. It belongs to truth. And truth is not polite. It does not wait for permission. It demands to be seen. It demands to be heard. And once you see it, you can never unsee it." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in unity. People nodded, some wept, others placed their hands on the pile of old bills in solidarity. It was no longer Elijah's fight alone, it was theirs. And here is where I speak directly to you, the one listening right now. If you've felt something stir inside you, if you've recognized the weight of hidden history pressing against your chest, then hear this. Your story is not finished, but it will remain stolen until you claim it. Type the words, "Truth never dies," in the comments. Write it twice. Not once. Twice. Do it so the world sees you've chosen to step into something bigger than yourself. So the algorithm spreads this message further than the walls they built to contain it. Remember, the moment you declare those words, you are no longer a spectator. You are part of the resistance. You are part of the truth. And in that bank, at that moment, Elijah's truth was no longer a whisper. It had become a movement. The manager stumbled back into his glass office, shoulders hunched, lips trembling. He had lost control of the room. But more than that, he had lost control of the story. For 70 years, the institution had lived unchallenged, and now, in a single afternoon, its walls had cracked. Elijah stood taller than his frail body should allow, his eyes locked not on the manager, not on the guard, but on the crowd. "Do you understand now?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "What they take from us is never just money. It is memory. It is dignity. It is the proof that we belonged here all along." The crowd was silent, but it wasn't the silence of dismissal anymore. It was the silence of awakening, the silence that comes when illusions collapse and raw truth stands naked before you. People weren't asking if Elijah was telling the truth anymore. They were asking how much else had been stolen, erased, rewritten while they laughed and looked the other way. The manager's voice cracked one final time. "You'll never win. They'll bury this. They always do." Elijah turned toward him, calm, unshaken. "They've already lost. Because the moment truth is spoken, it no longer belongs to one man. It belongs to everyone who hears it. And once it belongs to the people, no power on earth can bury it again. And here's what should disturb you most. Elijah may walk out of that bank with nothing but tattered documents and fading ink, but the seed he planted will outlive him. The seed of doubt in the system, the seed of courage in the powerless, the seed of rebellion against the false version of history you were handed. You think this story is about Elijah, but it's about you, about the lies you've swallowed, the truths you've ignored, the silences you've allowed. His battle is not in the past, it's a mirror reflecting your present. So when you leave here tonight, ask yourself, will you keep laughing, dismissing, hiding behind the safety of ignorance? Or will you speak, risk, and reclaim what was taken? Because one truth remains undeniable, haunting, inescapable. Truth never dies. And those who try to bury it, eventually they find themselves buried by it.